Welcome to War Stories and Fairy Tales. I'm Scott, I'm your layman, and this is our history of war. And today we're going for the first time to the late Roman Republic, to the early 1st century BCE. We're not talking about Julius Caesar yet, but he's alive and he's on his way. Now, today we're looking at one of the conflicts that made Caesar's partners in the First Triumvirate two of the key players of this period. This war is going to give us a peek at just how things stand in the Republic on the eve of Caesar's rise to power, and it's also going to give us an example, all too common, I'm afraid, of a failed slave uprising. Because today's war story is about what the Romans called the Third Servile War, but you might know it as Spartacus Rebellion. But first, as always, I have a recommendation for you. Mike Duncan, the guy who did the History of Rome podcast, wrote a book called The Storm Before the Storm, the beginning of the end of the Roman Republic, about exactly the period we're looking at today. And even though we're not going to trace the whole thing in detail, because that's not what our show is about, it's a fascinating story. If you've ever wondered how and why Rome went from a republic to an empire, Mike's book is worth a look. The Storm Before the Storm. It's on Amazon, it's on Audible, and it's probably available from your local indie bookstore, which I highly recommend you support. So when we're finished here, go check it out. Okay, on to our war story. Just like always, before we get into it, we need to do some background. So the Third Servile War began in 73 BCE, which means it's been 129 years since Scipio Africanus defeated Hannibal at Zama. And boy, has it been an eventful century. So let's hit the high points. The end of the Second Punic War probably marked Rome's high point as a republic. Not in terms of land conquered, but in terms of the strength of its culture, its trust in its institutions, and its level of respect for what we call the rule of law. And over the next 100 years, Rome would use its power to expand its territory, just about doubling its size between 202 and 100 BCE. After gaining control of Carthage, they added new territories in the modern-day countries of Spain, France, Greece, the Balkans, and Turkey. And by the time we get around to Spartacus, Roman armies are at work expanding Roman territory even farther into Spain and at the other end of the Mediterranean in Syria. But that expansion has happened against a background of conflict at home. Because Carthage was the last and greatest power we could call an existential threat to the Republic. A power almost as great as Rome itself, who may have had the power to take down Rome and become the dominant power in its world. And that threat helped keep the Romans focused outward, working together to protect their culture from the enemies out there, rather than fighting each other over who was going to get to be top dog. But then suddenly that threat wasn't there anymore, and you had a culture built on discipline, strength, tolerance for hardship, and the determination to win any conflict, pretty much whatever it had to sacrifice to get there. And in order to accomplish that last goal, Rome had raised a breed of leaders who were both hyper-competent and hyper-ambitious. And when winning at any cost is one of your defining cultural values, that one tends to eventually overshadow the rest. So it didn't take long for these hyper-competent, ambitious guys to start measuring dicks against each other. Now this is going to be pretty simplistic because we got to go through it fast. Of course, the reality was more complex than what we can deal with here. That's why people have written whole books about it. So if this sounds interesting to you, check one of those out, like Mike Duncan's book. Anyway, the conflict took a general form that might appear familiar to you. Some of the powerful men of Rome, mostly the ones who had come up from powerful families, worked to keep their power. I'm sure some of them really thought they were the ones with the right answers, who could guide Rome to ever-increasing greatness. But there were plenty who just wanted to hold on to their power, because winning at all costs does not allow for you to surrender your power to somebody else just because he's smarter than you are, or a better leader, or has a better idea how to deal with whatever problem is on everybody's mind at the moment. And some of the powerful men of Rome, both established and up-and-comers, tried to leverage their connection with the common people to get and keep their support. Because no matter how big or open your ruling class is, it will always be smaller, a lot smaller than the class of people it's ruling. And I'm sure some of these guys also believed that what they were trying to do would be good for those people. And some just wanted to use them to increase their own power. Oh, they tried to hold on to the whole existential threat thing, but even that was pretty much gone by 146 BCE when the Third Punic War ended with the final destruction of Carthage. And even that war only lasted 3 years, and most of that was inventing an excuse to send an army across the Med, then actually sending it. The actual war went something like this. Rome accused Carthage of saying mean things in school and challenged it to a fight. Carthage said it didn't want to fight and even gave up all its weapons so Rome wouldn't have an excuse to attack. Rome said, "Thanks for making this easy," and proceeded to destroy the city and kill or enslave its people. And just like that, they didn't have an external threat they could point to when they needed to call for unity. So it was after 146 BCE that the social divisions between the nobility and the common folks really started to float up to the top. And as we said a minute ago, some of the politicians positioned themselves as Rome's rightful ruling class, the patricians, while others positioned themselves as the champions of the common class, the plebeians, which I grew up hearing pronounced plebeian. But lately I've heard a lot of folks pronouncing it plebeian. So I'm going to say plebeian, and you can use the pronunciation you prefer when you talk about these guys to people you want to impress. Anyway, these things happen much more gradually in real life than it seems like they did in a history video. But to keep things simple, we're going to skip to the part where two talented generals came to more or less embody the conflict between patricians and plebeians. Gaius Marius, who more or less represented the plebeians, and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, who more or less represented the patricians. Marius was about 20 years older than Sulla, so he came up first. He opened up the army to a broader cross-section of the population, allowing guys without property to enlist in the legions. And he started the practice of the state providing weapons and equipment to soldiers rather than requiring them to purchase them themselves. And he rewarded soldiers with land after their term of service ended. At least those are some of the reforms he often gets credit for. It's entirely possible that what we sometimes call the Marian reforms were instituted by others and just happened to coincide more or less with Marius's career. But the chaos that's about to erupt makes that a little hard to see from our vantage point. At any rate, he won some key victories with the army he may or may not have reformed and was elected consul an unheard of 7 times. Meanwhile, Sulla won some key victories in Africa and inside Italy, and when he and Marius started butting heads, he marched on Rome in 88 BCE and exiled him. Well, Marius only stayed away until Sulla marched his army east to deal with some jackass in Greece. Then he came back to Rome and started killing everybody who had ever thought about conspiring with Sulla. He died before Sulla returned, and Sulla had to fight a civil war to get his power back, but in 82 BCE, he came out on top at the Battle of the Colline Gate, got the Senate to name him dictator for life, and started killing everybody who had ever thought about conspiring with Marius. Yeah, the 80s BCE were kind of a shitty time to live in Rome. So fast forward to 78 BCE and Sulla's death, and the elites of Rome are kind of looking around wondering what to do now. Many of the most capable leaders have been killed in one or the other of the purges, and the ones who were still alive were understandably a little gun-shy about sticking their heads up. But they were still Romans, and within a few years, a new generation of leaders started showing up, ambitious, competent, disciplined, and now armed with a whole new box of tools Marius and Sulla had shown them how to use if they couldn't get the results they wanted through normal channels. Among these new leaders were a couple of guys who are going to be important today. Marcus Licinius Crassus and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. There's also a guy named Julius Caesar running around, but he has not yet shown his skills as a general and statesman and doesn't play much of a part in this war story. But in a few years, he's going to form an unofficial political alliance with Crassus and Pompey that's going to end up putting another couple of nails in the Republic's coffin. So that's the political situation in Rome when Spartacus did his thing. Popular and powerful leaders are measuring their power by counting the number of troops they lead. Everybody's still talking about the Republic, but it's staggering on shaky legs. But now we need to back up a little bit and look at a social arrangement that's kind of carrying the Republic on its back, the institution of slavery. See, slavery wasn't new to the Roman Republic. It wasn't new to the Greeks or the Assyrians or the Egyptians or even the Sumerians. Keeping people as property and making them work is one of those practices that go way, way back into the deepest mists of human history. When you look at it from that perspective, it's actually kind of amazing that we've managed to just about eradicate it in the last couple of hundred years. Now, I'm not suggesting that slavery is some kind of natural state or somehow beneficial or good for the poor bastards who find themselves enslaved. Just because it's always been part of human history doesn't mean it's a good thing. You know what else has always been part of human history? Endemic disease and plagues. And modern medicine has managed to mostly get rid of those, and that's a good thing. Same with starvation and slow travel and poor communication and illiteracy. Your world is much bigger than your grandparents' world, and that's mostly a good thing. So just to make sure my position is crystal clear, slavery is and has always been evil. And it's a fact of human history, and we don't get to ignore the ugly facts of history any more than we get to ignore our bank balance. Anyway, so slavery was the thing in the Republic, and most folks really didn't think twice about it. It just was. Some people used slaves to get their work done, just like some folks used animals to carry things that were too heavy for them to carry themselves. But slavery wasn't a racial thing in the Republic the way it was in the United States. They don't seem to have thought as much about race as we did in the West in the last few centuries, or even as much as we think about it today. Part of that was because the Roman world was pretty much confined to the Mediterranean, and you don't see a lot of variation in skin tones from Spain to Italy to Greece to the Levant to North Africa. Go outside that Mediterranean bubble and you would have started running into different skin tones, lighter to the north, darker to the south. But they don't seem to have tried to pigeonhole people into groups just based on the color of their skin. Instead, they thought of different cultures as different races. So a Celt and an Italian and a German and a Syrian and an Egyptian and a Nubian might all be considered different races, even though some of them might have very similar skin tones to each other. So race wasn't how the Romans distinguished slaves from free people. Instead, slavery was more of a social distinction. Some people were born slaves, and some became slaves through debt or crime or military conquest. And many slaves, especially those born into it or forced into it by debt, could hope for release at some point, whether by making enough money to buy their own freedom, working out the terms of their enslavement, or by somehow earning their master's respect or mercy. And former slaves could usually hope to live a more or less normal life, except they couldn't run for office. That's it. As long as they were slaves, they were pretty much the property of their masters, who could treat them pretty much however they wanted with very few guardrails. A slave working in a wealthy patrician's villa probably worked long hours with few breaks, and their body would have been at their master's disposal in just about any way you want to take that. But they would have had a more or less healthy diet, medical care when they needed it, and a place to sleep that was at least sheltered from the elements. A slave working in that same guy's fields would have had a much harder life and may or may not have had the meals and medical care and shelter. And the poor bastard working in the mines couldn't hope for much better than to just work himself to death as quick as he could. And then there's a special class of slaves called gladiators. So first of all, it's a little simplistic to call gladiators slaves. There were three main categories of gladiators, and believe it or not, they weren't all slaves. Most were. Your two main sources of gladiators were prisoners of war and criminals condemned to death, both of whom were pretty much doomed to fight in the arena until they died. But there was also a third class, the volunteers. Because believe it or not, people volunteered to fight in the arena. And in the late Republic, volunteers may have made up as much as half of all gladiators. And if you can get past the threat of imminent death, it actually made sense. A successful gladiator had something like the status level of modern day movie stars and rock stars and professional athletes all rolled into one. So for a young man trying to make his way in a chaotic society where the law may or may not protect you depending on who's in charge, the life of a gladiator probably looked like a fair bargain. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What did gladiators do? And why is it so surprising that somebody would volunteer to be one? Well, gladiators were entertainers who fought each other for the crowd's amusement. And we ain't talking about boxing here or even MMA. These guys fought with weapons, real weapons that were fully capable of maiming or killing the combatants. But despite what you saw in the movie Gladiator, they didn't always fight to the death. Usually they'd fight until one of the combatants yielded. Then the crowd got in on the action. If the defeated gladiator had fought well, they would usually call for him to be spared and fight another day. If he had fought poorly, or if they thought he was a coward, or if he had just failed to entertain them, they might call for the winner to kill him. Then the senior spectator present, you've seen it in the movies, maybe a consul or a senator or a tribune, would give the winner the thumbs up to let him live or the thumbs down to kill him. Gladiators specialized in different styles of combat and carried different types of equipment to match their styles. In the Middle and Late Republic, that usually meant they fought with the type of weapons they would have used wherever they came from. By the time the Empire replaced the Republic, things were more stylized, but in 73 BCE, gladiators, especially the prisoners of war, would have been fighting with equipment similar to what they carried when they fought against the legions. So how did this form of entertainment come about? It looks like the Romans picked it up from the Etruscans in the middle of the 3rd century BCE, around the time of the First Punic War between 264 and 241 BCE. The Etruscans fought gladiator fights as a form of human sacrifice called munera, to appease the gods at high-status funerals. And it looks like that's how it was for the Romans at first as well. But by 73 BCE, gladiators weren't just for munera anymore. They were popular enough and common enough that gladiator schools started to pop up to train men to fight in the arena. It's at one of these schools that Spartacus shows up for the first time. Unfortunately, we don't know much about Spartacus before he was a gladiator. And for all the statues and paintings and movies made about him, we actually have no idea what he looked like either. So what do we know? Well, he's supposed to have been a Thracian, which means he may have been from the part of the Balkans that's part of modern-day Turkey, or Greece, or Macedonia, or Bulgaria, or maybe even a little north of there. It's also possible that Thracian is a reference to a particular fighting style, the Thrax. We have sources that seem to imply he was taken by the legions as a prisoner of war, and other sources that say he was an auxiliary or mercenary who deserted and was made a slave when he was recaptured. But in 73 BCE, he was a slave at a gladiatorial school outside Capua, run by a dude named Lentulus Batiatus. He and about 70 of his gladiator buddies used kitchen implements, which to me means stuff like knives, cleavers, skewers, and spits, rolling pins, maybe a tenderizing hammer, maybe a pestle for grinding to bust out of their cell block. They then equipped themselves with proper gladiatorial weapons and armor, as you do, and made their merry way out of the school, probably throwing some very offensive language against any guards who might have tried to stop them. They headed out of town, and it looks like they chose 3 guys out of the group to be their leaders. 2 Gauls named Crixus and Onomaus, and Spartacus. They hung out near Capua for a little while, probably plundering the area, attacking travelers, recruiting other slaves to join them, and generally making a nuisance of themselves. Something like Robin Hood and his merry men, just with, more killing. And they probably didn't wear those nifty green hats either. So the city sent some troops out after him, and the gladiators promptly kicked their asses and took their shit. And suddenly they had military weapons and equipment in addition to their gladiator stuff. That was probably around the time the local authorities started to get the idea they had something more than just your typical escaped slaves turned biker gang running around in the woods. And before we go any farther with Spartacus, let's take a minute and talk about what slave rebellions looked like in the Republic before Spartacus's day. Now bear in mind that this probably isn't a comprehensive list of every slave revolt. These are just the ones that got big enough for the Romans to record them as wars and give them names. So the First Servile War started in 135 BCE in Sicily, when 2 slaves named Eunice and Cleon led a slave rebellion that ended up capturing and sacking several towns. Then the legions got involved in 134, and by 132 the revolt was officially put down. The Second Servile War also started in Sicily, when the governor in 104 BCE issued an order that freed about 800 slaves, then turned around a few days later and took it back. The slaves, predictably, said fuck that and revolted. A couple of dudes called Salvius and Athenian took charge, and the escaped slaves managed to fight off the legions until 100, when the rebellion was finally put down and 1,000 survivors sent to Rome to fight as gladiators. They apparently refused to perform for the crowd, instead quietly stabbing each other until the last guy threw himself on his own sword. So Spartacus and his buddies are about to start the Third Servile War. And you might have already noticed a couple of key differences between the first two and this one. First, this one is a revolt of gladiators, not just generic slaves, so these guys already know how to fight. And second, this one is inside Italy instead of over in Sicily. So yeah, looks like Rome is going to have to get involved directly here. But there's a problem. The legions are occupied elsewhere. A bunch are in Spain fighting to put down the constant revolts out there, and another big chunk is fighting in Turkey. So the troops available to put down these gladiators are limited. Pretty soon, that's going to become a problem. The BS meter for this war story is about a 6 out of 10. We have records from the Romans, especially from the guys who ended up finishing off the revolt, but nothing from the slaves themselves. There's lots of question marks here. No shit. There they were. Spartacus and his boys were hanging out in the woods near Capua, living the life of a bunch of walking Hell's Angels, and their gang was growing day by day. Slaves and other poor bastards with no particular prospects heard about these guys who had managed to break loose from society and set up a life where they could live by their own rules. And some of them decided, I want to be part of that, and managed to escape from whatever bonds held them where they were, and they came and found this band of escaped slaves. Pretty soon, the authorities got wind of what was going on, and they started trying to do something about it. The rebels had already killed the soldiers Capua had sent out after them, so it was clear the next attempt needed to be a little more robust. Well, the slaves could see that coming just as clearly as the Roman authorities could, and they knew they needed to find a more defensible hideout. So they left Capua and hiked over to Mount Vesuvius, where they set up a little town near the caldera. Because, as you know, Vesuvius was and still is an active volcano, and they continued to attract more slaves and downtrodden to their ranks. Well, the Senate hadn't quite caught wise just yet how serious a situation they had on their hands. So the next force they sent after the gang was a volunteer militia force of about 3,000 guys under Gaius Claudius Glaber. Now, these guys were not the kind of legionaries we've been talking about in our last couple of episodes. These were not the kind of guys who fought with Scipio Africanus, or Marius, or Sulla. This was more like sending the Texas State Guard up against a well-armed gang that was trying to secede and set up their own thing, like the Hells Angels, or the Crips, or the Bloods, or these days maybe MS-13. Except at this point, this slave gang wasn't nearly as big as any of those. So Glaber and his 3,000 militia set up camp at the base of Mount Vesuvius, blocking the only known route up or down the mountain, and they settled in for a siege, because it was not yet clear to them or to Rome just what they were dealing with here. I mean, maybe it should have been, because here's the thing about slave revolts. They almost never succeed. And when I say almost never, I mean I know of one off the top of my head, and that's the Haitian Revolution from 1791 to 1804. Because even more than other kinds of war, even more than other brands of rebellion and revolution, a slave revolt is absolutely a zero-sum game. The slaves have exactly two options: victory or probably a very gruesome and painful death. And the state they're trying to defeat simply can't allow them to succeed. Because if your culture and economy is based on slavery, and you allow one group of slaves to break out of their bonds, it's only a matter of time until another group tries. And very soon your culture and your economy are going to have to find another basis. And that, as I'm sure you can imagine, is a painful process for a state. So the state has to continue escalating the conflict until it can overcome the slaves. Period. It can't let them escape, and it can't let them win. So Glaber and his state guardsmen were Rome's first escalation, and they didn't understand the threat. They still thought they were dealing with a crime wave at the hands of a few escaped slaves, and they're about to pay for that. Because there's a rule of thumb soldiers understand. You always leave the enemy a way out, unless you want to find out just how hard he can fight when he has nothing to lose. Glaber didn't get that memo, and he's about to find out just how hard these gladiators can fight. So he and his 3,000 are hanging out on the lower slopes of Vesuvius, proud of themselves probably, and thinking these poor bastards would be asking for mercy any day now, just as soon as they started getting hungry. Meanwhile, Spartacus and his guys were using the vines that grew on the mountain to fashion ropes and ladders, which they then proceeded to use to climb down the other side of the mountain. You know, the side Glaber thought they couldn't get down? Then after they got down, did they slink away into the mists? Did they thank the gods for their escape and go find someplace to hide? Oh no. They probably had at least a few families with them by this point, women and children who might not have been able to climb down the ropes and the ladders. And the slaves didn't want to leave them behind. And besides, Glaber had fucked around, and it was time for him to find out. So the gladiators marched around the base of the mountain, caught his guys from behind, and pretty much wiped them out. And that's about all we know about the Battle of Mount Vesuvius. And it looks like the rebels actually stayed on Vesuvius, at least for a little while, because the Romans had time to send a second expedition out against them. This one was led by a praetor named Publius Verinius, and unfortunately we know even less about his attempt than we do about Glaber's. Presumably he brought more guys to the party than Glaber had, but it didn't matter. He split his forces for some reason, and the rebels defeated both elements in detail. And at some point in one of these battles, Onomaus, who you may remember was one of Spartacus's co-leaders, went down. So now it was just Spartacus and Crassus in charge. But now the slaves had the equipment and the weapons of the two armies they had crushed, as well as the posse that had gone out against them at the beginning, plus the gladiator weapons they had escaped with. This was shaping up to be a proper army. And by the end of 73 BCE, it looks like they had maybe 70,000 bodies in their camp. Some of those would have been women and children, but many more were escaped slaves or shepherds or herdsmen and other members of the lowest classes, and almost all of them would have been willing and able to take up weapons to defend their newfound freedom. And as the winter of 73 and 72 BCE settled in, they had some time to train. Because remember, Spartacus probably had military experience, and he probably wasn't the only one. And these guys would have known how to put together a training plan. And as we've already established, they had nothing to lose. They were going to figure out how to beat the legions, or they were all going to die. So as 72 BCE started, the Romans started to realize they had a situation developing. For the slaves part, it's hard to know just what they wanted. I mean, it's not hard to figure out they wanted to not be slaves anymore, but beyond that, it gets trickier. There's a theory that they were split into two factions, and Spartacus and his faction wanted to cross the Alps and get the hell out of Italy, while Crassus and his guys wanted to stick around and keep plundering Romans. But like I said, this is nothing but a theory based on where they were when they were ultimately taken down separately. If there's solid evidence for it, I haven't heard of it. And as much as we might want to believe they wanted to get Rome's attention and end slavery in the Republic, that doesn't seem to hold much water either. Remember that slavery was baked into the bones of Roman culture, and the idea that some lucky dudes got to be the masters while other poor bastards were stuck being slaves doesn't seem to have bothered much of anybody. This revolt seems to have been much more about, I'm not going back into chains, and not really at all about nobody should be in chains. At least if that was the goal, you'd think one or two of the ancient historians would have said something about it, and none did, at least that we know of. And unfortunately, we have no way of knowing for sure, because if they wrote anything down or talked to anybody about their plans, those records haven't survived. I mean, we can blame the Republic and say the patricians made sure to destroy any record of what they wanted other than just to pillage and destroy. But usually there's something left, some clue somewhere, even when the powers that were did their damnedest to suppress it. But here, there's nothing. So all we have to go by is what the Romans recorded about the events of this rebellion. So let's get back to that. In the spring of 72 BCE, it looks like Rome finally started taking this rebellion seriously. They sent out two consular armies, that is, armies commanded by the two consuls elected for the year, Lucius Gellius and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus, with orders to find the slave army and destroy it. No more state guard militia. These were real legions with real legionaries. And at first they seemed to have done okay. Gellius caught up with about 30,000 rebels under Crassus near Mount Garganus and killed 2/3 of them, including Crassus. And this, by the way, is the main evidence people seem to point to when they talk about a split between Spartacus and Crassus. They were far apart for this fight, and Spartacus seems to have spent a good chunk of the year fighting his way north toward the Alps. And that's about it. And it's true that Spartacus spent the rest of the year fighting his way north, but that might have just been because that's where the legions were. Gellius and Lentulus split their armies, maybe trying to catch Spartacus between them. But the risk of doing that is your enemy will catch them too far apart and be able to defeat them in detail, which is exactly what Spartacus did. He caught Lentulus right on the other side of the Italian boot from Rome, beat him, then turned and met Gellius about 50 miles to the south and beat him too. The consuls and what was left of their armies retreated back to Rome, and according to at least one account, Spartacus paired up 300 captured legionaries and forced them to fight to the death, gladiator style, to avenge Crassus's death. Then he turned his rebels north again and kept going, by now leading maybe as many as 120,000 total rebels. How many of them were fighters? Hard to say. But even if it was only half, that's a bigger army than Hannibal ever had in Rome. So he headed north, and the consuls got their shit together and headed back out after him again. And he beat him again at the Battle of Picenum and kept going north. He might have met a whole nother army in Cisalpine Gaul near the modern city of Modena and defeated it as well. But then he turned back south, marching all the way back down to Thurii in the Arch of the Boot, taking the city and setting up his winter quarters there. Which doesn't make a whole lot of sense if his plan was to escape over the Alps. I mean, he just defeated the last army between him and freedom, and he turns around? Now, it's possible it was too late in the year and the Alps were already impassable until spring. But if that was his plan, why not winter where he was and cross as soon as the mountains were passable in the spring? Turning back south, especially going all the way down to Thurii, doesn't make sense if he wanted to escape across the Alps. There's also a theory that he meant to march on Rome, but decided not to after Picenum for reasons. But if that was his goal, it seems like he could have hardly picked a better time than at the head of 80 or 100,000 guys after he had already defeated the consular legions 3 times in a year. So I'm not sure what Spartacus was trying to accomplish, and it's entirely possible he wasn't either. But here he is in Thurii, and Act 3 is about to begin. And spoiler alert, but Spartacus' story is a tragedy, so there ain't going to be any against the odds triumph in Act 3. But he doesn't know that yet. So he's going to pass the winter of 72 and 71 pretty much the same way he passed the previous winter, equipping and training his army. He may have refused to allow gold or silver to be used as coinage in his town, instead trading the loot he had collected to local merchants and traders in exchange for weapons and iron and other material that could be made into weapons. And you can be sure he spent the winter training the new guys who had come on board in 72. But shit was about to get real for Spartacus, because the Senate was scared now. And early in 71 BCE, they appointed Marcus Licinius Crassus a praetor and gave him 6 legions, maybe 40,000 guys, to put Spartacus down. So who was Crassus? Well, he had been one of Sulla's commanders during the Civil War, and now he was one of the richest men in Rome, if not the richest. He had built his fortune largely in real estate. And by real estate, I mean he had a private fire brigade. And when he got word that somebody's house was on fire, he would haul ass over there with his firefighters and ask the owner to sell him his house for an absurdly low price. If the owner accepted, Crassus would have his firefighters put out the fire in his new building. If not, they would stand there and watch as it burned to the ground, presumably making similar bids on its neighbors' houses. So yeah, this was the kind of guy Crassus was. Mission-focused to the exclusion of petty concerns like other people's welfare. I've never heard him described as a military genius, but his command philosophy was an effective one. If his men were more afraid of him than they were of the enemy, they would stand fast when the fighting started. Darth Vader would have found no reason to strangle this guy. And now, he was the MFIC of the hunt for Spartacus and his rebels. One of the first things he did on taking command was to implement a policy of brutal discipline. You received an order, and you carried it out. Period. Failure to do so carried extreme penalties, up to and including torture and execution. One of the penalties he revived hadn't been seen in the legions for more than a century, if it was even a thing at all before Crassus. There's some question there. It was the practice of decimation. You've heard that word, of course, but these days we usually use it to mean a unit that suffers extremely high casualties in battle. That's not what Crassus had in mind. No, decimation in the late republics meant taking a unit that had performed poorly in battle, especially that had shown cowardice before the enemy, forming it up in front of the army, having the men draw lots, and then executing 1 out of every 10 men. And that's not even the worst of it. Their companions, the one who had drawn the so-called good lots, they were the ones who had to do the killing. Yeah, holy shit is about right. When somebody talks about brutal Roman discipline, this is the kind of thing they're talking about. Now, it's not clear exactly when Crassus actually used this penalty, but I don't think it was right away. I'll tell you in a minute when I think he did. So Crassus came up against Spartacus for the first time back up near Picenum, or possibly farther south in Samnium. He positioned 4 of his legions to block Spartacus's path, sending the other 2 under a general named Mummius to get behind him, but not to engage him. It looks like the plan was to let Spartacus see Mummius behind him and encourage him to pull away toward Crassus's main body. Well, Spartacus had already shown himself fully capable of defeating separated legions in detail, so I'm not sure why he didn't do that this time. Or maybe he did, but that's not how the story comes down to us. Because Mummius saw an opportunity to kick Spartacus in the ass, and he took it. and Spartacus kicked his ass instead. Maybe he drew Mummius into a trap, or maybe his armies were just that much better at maneuver, or maybe he just had more dudes on the ground than Mummius thought he did, or maybe Mummius underestimated him just like everybody else had. It's just not clear. But Mummius attacked against Crassus's orders and got his pee-pee whacked by Spartacus for his trouble. And his troubles were far from over, because Crassus managed to make a meal out of the shit sandwich Mummius had made for him, defeating Spartacus and killing maybe 6,000 of his guys and driving him off. And then he turned his attention to Mummius. And this is where I think he must have actually implemented his policy of decimation. The legions that had acted against orders had gone up against this guy who had consistently kicked the ass of every legion that tried to take him, and had just almost fucked up the whole operation in the process. These were the guys Crassus decimated. No word on what he did to Mummius, but I'm gonna guess it hurt his feelings. So that little detail dealt with, Crassus turned his attention back to Spartacus. He pursued him down into the very toe of the Italian boot, where Spartacus is supposed to have made a deal with some pirates to carry him and some of his rebels across to Sicily, where he could keep stirring up his rebellion. Supposedly the pirates, being pirates, took his money and left him and the rest of the rebels high and dry, out there flapping with the legions closing in from the north. It's a great story, and that part of it might be true, but there's a lot of holes here. Where the hell is the Spartacus who won all those battles? Are we supposed to believe that 120,000 rebels are now running scared from 40,000 legionaries? Is Crassus's reputation for ruthlessness so extreme that Spartacus can't persuade his rebels to go up against him? Has the rebellion just evaporated around Spartacus to the point that he can't stand and fight and has to figure out how to run? He probably also knew by now that more legions were on the way, coming from Spain under Pompey and from Anatolia under Lucullus, but as long as he could take them on separately, I kind of like Spartacus's chances. Something doesn't add up here, and it's one of the frustrating things about studying this war. But however it happened, whatever pieces are missing from the story, this is where we are. Spartacus and his rebels are stuck in Bruttium, at the very tippy toe of the boot, and Crassus is closing in. Crassus sets his legions to digging a dike and wall obstacle all the way across the peninsula, something like 60 clicks or 36 miles. And Spartacus went to Crassus to see if they could work out some kind of a truce. Well, Crassus was concerned about Pompey and Lucullus stealing the credit for putting the rebellion down, and he told Spartacus to go pound sand, which tells me he felt pretty good about his chances. And Spartacus went back to his rebels and started working on plans to break through the legions. It looks like the plan he came up with was a series of sneak attacks, probably several at once, probably at night. The slaves attacked silently and took out the Roman sentries with the intent to punch holes through the Roman lines, then escape through the holes. And it looks like they got about 50,000 through, leaving 12,000 behind. Whether the 12,000 stayed back to hold the legion's attention, or those were just the poor bastards who couldn't get through, isn't clear. But Crassus attacked as soon as he figured out what was happening, and his newly disciplined and ruthless legions dropped the hammer on the ones left behind. Then he turned around and chased after the 50,000 that had gotten away. Spartacus turned to fight, and in what we call the Battle of the Salarius River, his rebels finally went toe-to-toe with Crassus's legions. Supposedly, Spartacus posted himself in front of his army and killed his horse right there where everybody could see, saying if they won, there would be plenty of horses, and if they lost, well, he wouldn't need a horse then. The only account I can find of the battle itself gives us very little detail. It seems like Spartacus tried to penetrate into the Roman formation to find and kill Crassus, but he couldn't get there and went down trying. His body was never identified or recovered. About 5,000 rebels escaped the field, with another 6,000 captured. The rest were killed in the fighting. Remember what we said about finding out how hard your enemy can fight when he's got nothing to lose? Seems like that wasn't enough for the rebels. I couldn't find anything on Roman casualties, but between Crassus's leadership style and the slaves' desperation, you got to imagine they weren't peanuts. Till Spartacus is dead and the rebellion is crushed. But that wasn't enough, because no slave-holding society can allow an uprising like this to go without a visible reminder of the consequences when slaves rise up. So Crassus ordered the 6,000 survivors crucified along the Appian Way, the road that runs to Rome through Capua, the region where the rebellion had started. 6,000 guys were crucified right there by the sides of the road. The crosses spread out for miles so everybody could see what happens. And unlike your typical crucifixion, where the victim was pulled down within a day or so after he was dead, they just left these guys there. So even months later, you could have traveled the Appian Way and seen the crosses and whatever was left of the poor bastards who had died up there. And the 5,000 rebels who escaped didn't fare much better. I'm not sure how far they got, but Pompey and his legions tracked them down, killed them all, then went back to Rome and claimed credit for ending the rebellion. He and Crassus were elected consuls together for 70 BCE, and a decade later they went in with Julius Caesar to form the first triumvirate and put the final nail in the Republic's coffin. But they never liked or trusted each other ever again after Pompey grabbed Crassus's glory. And it seems like the condition of the slaves may have gotten a little better after the rebellion, but it's hard to say whether the rebellion was the cause of it. Slaves and freedmen alike did have more legal rights in the late Republic and the early Empire than they had before, and to the end of the Western Empire, there weren't any more slave revolts. So maybe Spartacus inspired a trend. And even though we know a fair bit about how the war went down, we don't know enough about any of the battles to be able to do a proper scorecard, unfortunately. There'll be other battles for Crassus, but none for Spartacus. Well, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this war story, please give me a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Leave me a comment or a question if you have something to share. Your engagement really helps us out. And please tell your friends about me, especially the one you're thinking about right now. Till next time, I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. Have a good one.